Yeah, I think our strategy on this is we want to solve the problem of AGI. So now
Right,
the
right,
question is, what we have to have these like layers of backup plans in case
right.
plan A doesn't work. So
Right.
originally plan A was like, well, no one's building a humanoid robot that could supply the kind of data to solve the AGI problem. So we're going to have to do it ourselves.
Hey, y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I am super happy to be speaking to Suzanne Gildert, who is a CTO and co-founder of Sanctuary.ai, a robotics company that is focused, a little bit different focus. So I actually want you to sort of introduce yourself. Why Sanctuary? Why the name? I think that's really interesting. And what were you trying to solve when you all back in 2018, right? Is that when you started the company? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, 2018. And thanks, John, for the opportunity to speak on your podcast today. Super excited. So what is Sanctuary? Well, we were founded with the mission of creating human-like intelligence in general purpose robots. And there's a bit of an interesting backstory because I actually founded a company in 2014 called Kindred. And we were going after a similar mission, but we worked products in warehouse and e-commerce opportunities for that. And it turns out that those kind of robots don't really need to be so general purpose. They can actually be programmed with more special purpose AI techniques. So Sanctuary was kind of spun off from that to go after that more original mission of artificial general intelligence in robots. So we kind of put a set of golden rules in at the start of the founding of the company. And one of them was that we're always trying to stick to something that's the most human-like form factor we can build. So one of the founding tenets of Sanctuary is to stay close to the human-like form factor. So I've been asked over the years, like, why do you do this? Why do you do that? Why do you put 5 fingers? Why does it have a moving head? All this kind of stuff. It's very simple for us. We want to make it as human-like as possible. And why? Because we want to build a mind that is as human-like as possible. And again, people argue with me about this constantly. Why would you want to do that?
Right.
We can get into that, but that's our mission. We want to build a human-like mind in a human-like body for many, many, many different reasons. And just to answer your question about why the name Sanctuary, well, when we started this, you could either think 2014 or 2018, depending on which company you're considering. This was completely science fiction. If you said to someone, we want to build a humanoid robot and make it move and talk and behave and interact like a person, everyone thought you were completely crazy. And you probably were. So the idea of the name Sanctuary was that we wanted to create a place which was a little bubble, a little safe space where everyone who believed in this idea, maybe like secretly and didn't like to say it out loud, but they truly believed in it, could come and feel at home. So it was a sanctuary for people that believed in the same mission we did without having to worry about what the outside world thought of that. And it was also a sanctuary for the AIs themselves, a place where they could grow up in the safety of people that really cared about the mission and wanted to make this technology real in the world in a way that benefits society.
Awesome. That's great. And as I was showing a couple of quick shots of it, so Phoenix is your Gen 6 robot, is that correct?
So that's right. Yep.
Right. Impressive. It's like, I guess if you count Kindred, it's more like a decade, but you're looking at 5 or 6 years. So that's a generation per year. Very, very awesome
That's
stuff.
right. That's right.
Yeah. Cool. So please tell me, this is probably not true, but as soon as I saw Sanctuary, I immediately thought of Logan's Run, and I thought of the safe place that they all go to at the end of it. And please tell me that has something to do with the name.
Unfortunately not.
Darn. Okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm just old. So I'm like, I grew up in the 70s. So it's like, that was a big thing. All right. So I'm going to add Dr. Scott Walter to the conversation. And Scott, you are very fortunate because you get to talk to Suzanne twice in less than a week. So yes.
And Suzanne, we have to stop meeting this way.
I know.
Speaking of which, Herbert Ong and Scott did an interview with you, chat with you previously, and I will leave a link to that in the description. I'm going to kind of consider that almost a compliment or a pairing to this, because there's a lot of stuff you went into in that. And so I think that we can actually talk about some different things that actually come out of that conversation. So the first thing, of course, is you're flipping things on its head a little bit. Like if we look even back as far as Boston Dynamics or something that was kind of an originator of this, it was all about the mechanics. How do you get a bipedal robot to work? They started off with like a little hoppy thing that went run around, much less about the brains, much more about the mechanisms. And that was very important because of course you had to have that before you could get to thinking about the smarts. But it sounds like most of you, and I've looked in, you and Jordy both coming from D-Wave, right? And potentially other people. So anyway, a quantum computing company. I believe you guys did simulated annealing search engines, right? That was you. That was what you primarily focused on. Yeah. So very, very cool stuff. And I've followed D-Wave for ages.
Well, they were quantum annealing, which is like the kind of supercharged version of simulated annealing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Using quantum.
You can do oh my gosh, what am I thinking of? Superposition of states. That's the word I'm looking for. So you could do that, and you could effectively do, like, you could do the annealing kind of all at once, right? I mean, that was the sort of beauty of it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, very cool. It's these days, I guess it would be considered a classical AI technique because nowadays it's all about the neural net and stuff. But I don't know. I think these things will have a comeback. There's a reason to do more procedural.
Well, anytime you need to do like probabilistic sampling, then the quantum computers is very cool for that. So actually, one of the things I think super cool is maybe when probabilistic models start coming back into fashion a little bit in AI, maybe we can go back to some of the quantum techniques there. They tend not to be as popular nowadays with all these transformers and everything, but who knows what's next.
Yeah. And you may not be able to talk about this, but I'm very curious about it's Carbon, right? Is the brain of Phoenix. Are you guys more focused specifically on things like transformers and stuff like that now? Are you sort of following the herd, I guess, or have you taken a different path?
Yeah, so the history of Carbon is super interesting because we've been trying to build this cognitive architecture for many, many years now. And it's undergone about 4 or 5 different revisions, just like the robot has. So what we started with, back in the day before the power of transformers was really discovered, was doing a modular AI approach where we're using lots of different algorithms. And some of them weren't even neural net-based learning approaches. They were just standard optimization motion planning approaches to plan trajectories for the robot arm, things like that. We put those together with some other techniques. We were looking at language generation models. Even before the latest and greatest ones were popular. We even looked at things like char-RNN back in the day, if anyone remembers.
Right. Yeah, I do.
we were playing with those language models back then as well. So that was super fun, and they've kind of evolved. And we also looked a lot into symbolic logic and reasoning planners as well. We did some work with the psych technology to see if we could do symbolic logic and reasoning, put that in. And then we had a whole bunch of other interesting, what I'd call, they were sort of techniques that are peripheral to AI. So maybe not what people think of as machine learning and data-driven approaches now, but they were things like memory systems. So the system would learn a task plan, and then it would write that to a kind of procedural motor memory. And then that task plan now became available for recall. We had that kind of system. And then we even had a system that was a basic emotion-based system as well. So what the emotion system would do is it would it would take in perception data coming from the robot and then decide what the emotional state of the robot was. And I could go into detail about how it did that.
So
and then it would
internal.
modify. It would modify
I thought you were talking about like sentiment analysis or something like that.
Oh, no. This is kind of internal emotion system.
Yeah.
So there were a whole bunch of different cognitive architectures we played with around these concepts. So what we did is all that's still valid, and we have all that kind of like knowledge and all that IP and stuff in the background, but we wanted to really focus down on what we thought was a missing piece. Because you can build an amazing cognitive architecture with emotion and memory and language and, task planning, procedural memory, all these cool things. But if the robot can't move its body correctly, interact with the environment, pick something up, like it just, you can't leverage all these other parts, because where the rubber hits the road is how that embodied AI system literally moves its body around in the world to do things. So what we did with this Carbon 3.0 that we've developed is we went back to basics and we said, okay, let's design the cerebellum part from scratch. So the part we're focusing on now is what you might think of as in the brain. It's like the cerebellum and the procedural motor memories system that we have. So you can think of Carbon 3.0 as focusing down on this idea of learning policies through either behavior cloning or reinforcement learning. Now think of those as individual little policies that are tested.
Right.
And then those can be put into a multi-purpose foundational model. And that model can now have hooks into it from something like a large language model or some other part of cognitive architecture. So
right.
the way Carbon, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just thinking, so in a sense, sort of like a motion alphabet in a way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So you can think about training these. Carbon has two autonomous modes. It's got single purpose mode and multi-purpose mode. So single purpose mode is kind of really just an interim mode where we want to test whether we can train individual policies one by one. So you can think of that as just like grasp an object, place an object, rotate an object, these little individual policies, and you test them in single purpose mode. But multi-purpose mode is when you take all the data from all those policies and use it to train one foundational motion model. And now at this point, instead of having all these single purpose policies in a library where the rest of your software system is just choosing one program from a library, all those are now in the same neural net. So you still have something that chooses, but now it hooks directly into the neural net. And that can come from something like a large language model as well. So the kind of grand vision of Carbon is you just say something to the robot, like put all these boxes on the shelf. The large language model now turns that into a representation that can be fed into the large behavior model neural net. And then that selects implicitly from all these policies it's already been trained on. And then it just executes that. So the transformer neural net inside the large behavior model turns a conditioning input on what you're actually doing into actual motor movements on the robot.
Very, very cool. So yeah, and I maybe we're seeing some of that going on right now. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah. I think Suzanne and I kind of talked about this offline last time. Let me make sure that this is sort of the same analogy that we had, is that you can look at the movements of the hands of being made up of each digit going to different locations. And you have a continuum here or infinite number of positions, or you can start to discretize them and start to think of them almost as like letters that make up words. And then you have certain rules that say which letter combinations are valid and not valid. And and the last time and from that, you end up creating a vocabulary. And of course, we know the English vocabulary is something like close to 500,000 words, but day to day, we only use like 500. So you get like a Benford's rule there of how many you use. The same thing like with your finger locations. There's certain ones that are going to be more common. So internally, the robot is internalizing it as its own tokens, which are, you can think of these as a bunch of letters that will be like one of those super strong passwords that you have that no one will be able to understand. But large language models are really good at being able to translate from one language to another. So when I say grasp, it says grasp is this gobbledygook, which are these letters, and that gobbledygook then turns into actual motor motion that is able to go ahead and accomplish something. So
That's right.
Okay.
It is, although there's maybe a slight nuance, which is the gobbledygook is kind of constructed or compiled from the situation you're in. So when you say grasp grasp comes down from the large language model, not only is it using that instruction, it's also using input from its perception and its foundational vision models to now decide how to grasp.
So it's like a large language model. It's like that you have some initial thing, but you've got some latitude on, you ask it to compose something and it can write whatever you want. In this case, you're composing motion out of a prompt, and then it's looking at all this other contextual information. You can think of that normally you have like a temperature setting that you would normally do to make sure that every time you get the same prompt, something comes up. Well, in this case, your temperature setting is the fact that your environment is a little bit different. But you could imagine that you have grasp, and then you have grasp mouse, grasp bottle, stuff like that. In which sense it already kind of knows the right word or letter combination to go in there for that.
That's right. And
again, because you have that much smaller vocabulary, it will generally choose from that because that's what's more common. And then remember, I asked you the question about live long and prosper, and you said it could do it. And then the one thing I was thinking is like, well, this is like one of those examples where the letter combinations may not work out for all people. So I knew you could actually get Phoenix to do that, but I wasn't sure if the teleoperator could. So, because not everyone can actually do that particular thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
that's
it's going to come from whatever the data set is of what, sampling from the wider human population. So again, if you want Phoenix to be able to play the piano, then you have to make sure you actually have someone who knows how to play the piano to teach that. Otherwise, it won't be able to do it unless it starts improvising on its own and figures that out on its own, which would be wild.
We're going to get to that because I want to
Yeah.
talk about simulation too. So,
when I
yes,
get 2 points, 2 points I want to get in here quick first. First, I have
Yes,
to
go
ask Suzanne: are you and Phoenix kindred souls?
I think so. I mean, I would.
You don't realize? No. I'm the punster on here. That was like a dad joke. Okay.
I get it. I get
Okay,
it.
you get it.
Kindred
Second
spirits,
question.
yeah.
Yes. In Phoenix, usually means rising from the ashes. What was Phoenix rising from?
I think the kind of concept of Phoenix rising from the ashes is an ongoing, evolving system, right?
Okay, you're constantly burning it down. Okay, it's like Carthage.
Because when you work in engineering, it's sometimes really difficult to kind of like kill all the darlings and start from scratch and realize that you've designed something and it's great and it's amazing, but it has its limitations, it has its ceiling. And so I want to try and instill a culture here where it's okay. It's okay to start from scratch. It's okay to like burn everything down and start again. We've had to do that many times.
Yeah, that's good. And again, Sanctuary, I think I said this before, that paraphrasing Arthur C. Clarke, who said that the space elevator will be built 50 years after everyone stops laughing. And so the same thing with the humanoid bots, that the human
Nobody's
bots
laughing
will
anymore.
be built 5
Nobody's
years
laughing.
after that. Not 50 is
I
going to be
mean,
like
they
5
were
years.
5 years ago when we were first socializing this idea.
Oh,
with,
yeah.
Investors and customers.
No one would say anything about it. It's like, no. So now people can start to come out of the closet and say, yes, I was behind that 15 years ago. It's just that
there we go.
no one would let me talk about it.
I definitely want to talk about simulation because you mentioned that in Herbert's interview, and I want to go down that rabbit hole because that's one of the areas that I actually focus on myself. But first of all, I want to talk, this direction, about the little, what color is that? Sort of a violet purple light that's on there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that indicates that, is it a he? Is it a she? I don't know what to call it. It is in teleoperation mode, correct? Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So this is more, I guess this is sort of like creating a training set and showing the dexterity of the robot over the actual carbon algorithm that's actually firing at the moment, right? So it's more like in its learning mode. Yeah. Okay. And again, as Scott and you were both talking about, what you're doing is, so you've got some sort of like, I guess more hard code is not the right way to put it, but a little bit more heuristically controlled classic AI types of techniques that are being accessed by this sort of master neural network that's controlling all these things. So part of what you're doing here, of course, is, or maybe that's incorrect. Maybe that's not the right way to look at this.
Well, maybe I could jump in there. There's sort of three ways you can use to collect to kind of generate data here. So one of them is just straight up teleoperation. So you're literally just taking data episodes from a human pilot. Now that's kind of expensive in terms of, a person has to sit there in a suit, and it obviously runs at like 1x speed because a person is moving at that speed.
Horribly unscalable.
Yeah. So although you can scale it, and maybe we could get into that later.
It could also be slower, because sometimes teleoperation is so difficult the human operator can't even go at their normal 1x speed.
So that's one way, but then you can augment that with 2 extra data collection techniques. So one of them is reinforcement learning. So if you know what you want the system to do, or you know what the outcome needs to be, and you can program that in somehow, then you can let reinforcement learning algorithms just try millions and millions of things. And so the ones that succeed can then now become, they can either train the algorithm directly, or they could be used to train a different algorithm as well with good episodes. And then the third way is you can actually solve the problem using classical techniques, and then use demonstrations of the problem being solved, say by something like a classical motion planner, as training data for a neural net or a data-driven approach. Now,
so you can just do a mean squared error kind of like, as it's doing the motion, you're just doing an MSE at every time step or something like that to see where it's mistaking it. Oh, that's very clever. Okay, that'll work.
And the cool thing about those other 2 techniques is you can get a lot more data. Now, the downside of them is it's not very human-like. So what reinforcement learning algorithms and also classical motion planning algorithms tend to discover is ways of moving the arm that a person would never do. they work, but they kind of like don't look very, very human-like. And so you might say, well, why do you care about that? But one of the important reasons is that these robots are going to be working alongside us. We're going to be interacting with them on a daily basis, and having something that's predictable in terms of how it's moving is actually very important when you have a robot working alongside someone. So if it's moving its arm very naturally to, say, pick a piece off an assembly line and place it somewhere else, that is a much safer, much better way of integrating a robot into human environment than if it's doing something really weird with
as
sound.
opposed
you
to
don't
doing
have
this, turning the box around
exactly.
like that, and it just doesn't look natural. You want to see.
Right.
Because the other thing is,
and you have
that
the
elbow swing. You need to predict that. When humans are walking past other humans, we kind of know what we think they're going to do. And if that elbow comes up, it's because they actually intended to do that, as opposed to that's the way they would naturally do it. Yeah.
Right. Although I'm the kind of person who puts my elbows up all the time and just hits random people. So I'm that clumsy guy. But I was going to say also, you've got the uncanny valley aspect of it too, because you want it. I noticed that you have head motion in Phoenix. And of course, there are other companies like Tesla that initially decided that Optimus was not going to have that. And then they backpedaled on that. And obviously the latest generation of their bot has, and it looks much more natural instantly. So I think that is,
but it only has two.
Interesting. Yeah. Yes,
2 degrees. Yeah.
But
head motion, I think head motion is really, really important, because when you're working alongside a robot, there's a thing we do as people, which is called shared attention, where you know what a person is thinking about what they're going to do next based on where their head and where their eyes are looking. So if you can bake that into the way a robot works, then it's just a much better cobot. It's a much better collaborator. And we want these robots to be working next to people, with people, alongside people. So to me, that's critical.
Yeah, and to make it clear, you have
so
full head motion. You don't have limited head motion. You
that's
have
correct.
The extra degree of freedom.
Yeah. It has 3 degrees of freedom in the neck. Actually, one of our previous robots had 5 degrees of freedom in the neck, which I believe is closer to the human head, because the human head actually pivots at 2 points, or the human neck actually kind of like pivots at 2 points, not 1. But yeah,
if you want to do that duck walk, you need that.
Do the groove.
That's really interesting, because of course, when I teach 3D animation and we're doing character rigging, it's always how many joints do you put in the neck, how many do you put in the spine, things like that. And it's how closely do you want to mimic humans versus just cartoon characters. So yeah, very interesting stuff. So this gets us into simulation, because obviously when you talk about reinforcement learning, the ideal place to do that is not in reality, because you can parallelize it. So you can go 1,000,000x, standard speed if you want to, because you can run it on a bunch of GPUs. So I noticed that you said that you're really looking at 2024 being a year for synthetic data collection, synthetic data work, working on, are you working on like the physics model? Like, where are you in terms of that simulation engine?
Yeah. So it's, again, this sim to real gap is still an open question that has to be solved. So the way I'd characterize it is that this sim to real gap is not a one thing. It depends on what task you're doing and how complex the environment and the objects are. So for some things, sim to real gap is kind of been closed and we can transfer. So recently we've been showing some super cool results, which I'm actually going to post to social soon. So watch out for those, where we've done what's called zero-shot transfer from simulation into the real robot. So what that means for the non-technical folks is it means you've done all your training in simulation, model training, and then you haven't changed a thing. You just run that same model on the robot and it works first time round. So that's kind
remarkable, by the way.
It's remarkable that it works. But then if a non-expert was watching this, what they would say is, oh, but that's a really simple task. Like all it's doing is pushing an object or touching an object, a very simple grasp of a kind of like a solid block object, something like that. So these are the cases where the sim to real transfer does work, when you've got something that the physics engine in the simulation is actually close to reality. Now, the problem with most of these physics engines, though, is for many things, they are not close to reality at all. Right. So things like soft-bodied objects like clothing, food, squishy things like that, we just do not have the physics technology yet. Now it's coming down the pipeline. But what that means is that if you're handling those kind of things, it won't work. So simulation is still absolutely critical. You can still use it as a big piece of your foundational model, because a lot of what we interact with are these kind of Yes, it's just a video of a soft
Yeah.
body object too.
Squishy object. Yeah.
Yeah. So try and simulate that. It's actually really hard to simulate that.
Right. Right.
For those kind of things, we still need to get data from real life, from the real physical robot doing the task.
Okay, can we look at it another way? Is that in theory, we know how to write the physics for that. It's just the amount of compute for it is just ridiculous.
It's a combination. Yeah, there's a combination of things here.
And you've seen a lot of these AI techniques that have been used to predict physical systems with almost better accuracy than reality, like some weather forecasting things. You see them, making waves in the ocean, so they almost do chaos better and turbulence. So I'm almost wondering, like, is it possible that you can start looking at some of those physical problems and say, let's train the AI to give us the right physical model and now put that in there?
Yeah, we could do that. So that's called neural physics, and people are exploring it. And it's kind of funny because now you're modeling the environment and physics using a neural net. And then you're now using another neural net to like learn from that neural net when you're training an AI in there. So neural physics is super interesting. I mean, the best known example of this so far is NERFs. So that's an example of a type of neural physics for vision.
Which, so just for people who don't know, neural radiance fields, by the way.
I was going to explain.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Go for it. No, go for it.
It's the basic idea is you take a lot of data in from a camera, and then the camera learns the hidden causes of that vision information that's coming in. So the neural net actually learns representations of three-dimensional objects, even though everything it's seeing is coming in two-dimensionally. And then it can obviously then in-paint, if you're walking around a room, it can kind of in-paint part of the scene that you haven't actually seen before and things like that. So that's an example of neural physics for vision, but you can also have neural physics for other modalities and other things as well. So you could have a neural physics engine that learns what would come into a robot's haptic sensors if it were touching the environment, or what collisions would happen with a robot's arm if its arm were coming into collision. So all those things could be learned from data as well, technically.
Right.
well, then I think you could have a cottage industry then of people just going out there and doing whatever the experiments are to teach these neural physics what a Nerf ball is like. Just a little bit of a
and neural physics is really
a baseball versus a golf ball versus any other objects.
It's really the future as well. So I know we wanted to talk about quantum at some point, but neural physics is the only way we can actually create virtual 3D environments that actually have the kind of physics from reality in them, because we do not know how to simulate things like quantum mechanics. So this sounds kind of silly. Like, why would you want to simulate quantum mechanics? Like, what's your robot going to be doing is it going to be like running a quantum computer in virtual reality? No, but I like to think of the example of a CD. So if you've got a CD, look, it's shiny. So you're like moving it around in the light and it's like all these nice colors and everything. Well, those colors are coming from quantum mechanical effects. Right. So if you want a physics engine that can simulate a CD and how it looks in real life, we can't do that with physics because we can't solve a Schrödinger equation in real time. So what you have to do there is you have to run neural physics, because what you're running in neural physics is you're kind of like learning what those reflections look like at different angles without necessarily having to know the underlying physics of how that works. Right. So I find that kind of stuff fascinating, but neural physics is really the only way we'll ever get like true physics models, I think.
Yeah, because neural physics basically knows what it should look like.
Yeah,
we know what things are able to look like. We're very good at that because we've been taught the same thing.
Because we can predict what the CD is going to do, right? But we're not like solving the Schrödinger equation in our brain.
And I think, John, the same thing, that when you go into computer animation and you animate something like that, people can tell right away. It's like, oh, that looks completely fake, because they have an expectation because they have their own neural physics in their head.
Right. Yeah, weight is with my beginning animators, weight is always the problem. They create these things that look like they're just kind of floating or they're underwater or something, and I'm always like, you guys it's like you got to pay more attention to the way that you actually see things. But I mean, I think you're right. Just the fact that we can see, we have glasses, we have clear corneas in the front of our eyes. That's all due to quantum mechanics that wouldn't exist otherwise, classical mechanics. So there's a lot people who think that quantum mechanics doesn't matter. Plus the fact all this stuff that we're communicating with each other right now
Oh yeah.
completely quantum mechanics based.
Especially if it's
yes.
underlying consciousness as well. It really does matter.
Yeah. And we're going to get to that too. I really want to talk about that in a second, because that was like the most exciting thing.
Mhm.
So I guess you've talked about how you care less about the hardware, although you've gone through 6 generations and you've got a very attractive, Phoenix looks pretty put together. But it sounds like you
Oh yeah,
don't
Phoenix
care
pretty
as
sexy.
yeah, Phoenix is sexy. Phoenix does a sexy bot. So there we go. But you don't care as much about that. And I think you've said you're willing to partner with other players in terms of manufacture and things like that. It's much more about what's going on up here. Well, or
Mhm.
probably in here for the bot. But anyway, so do you kind of consider yourselves, I guess, if you had like the Apple iPhone versus Android or something, it's like, I mean, I know Google makes their own pixels, but it's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, use our OS and make your own phone and we'll just be inside it.
Yeah, I think our strategy on this is we want to solve the problem of AGI. So now
Right,
the
right,
question is, what we have to have these like layers of backup plans in case
right.
plan A doesn't work. So
Right.
originally plan A was like, well, no one's building a humanoid robot that could supply the kind of data to solve the AGI problem. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. So we always like think like this, think like, how are we going to get to AGI the fastest? What do we do? So there we needed to build the robot because it didn't exist. That was like 5 years ago. So now other humanoid robots are starting to be developed. Now, we don't believe that any of those are yet good enough to solve the full AGI problem, including ours. So we're continuing to work on ours, and we're monitoring everyone else's, and we're monitoring what's going on in the field. But the minute another humanoid robot comes out that we think is good enough to supply the right kind of data to solve the AGI problem, if at that point it's cheaper and easier to maintain than ours, we would switch over, and available, I have to say as well, because it has to be
Yes.
something that we can actually access. So one of the reasons we're
Right.
still building our own is there's just nothing out there that we can access that's kind of like commercial, off the shelf, ready to go, that has all the right sensors and actuators to solve the problem.
And
Now,
that's a story I hear repeated over and over from people in the robotics industry, is like, yeah, we're doing it ourselves because we had to vertically integrate, because literally there was nothing there to not vertically integrate. So yeah. Okay.
And often
Very
as well,
interesting.
if you vertically integrate, you have control of the entire stack, all the way
Right.
from the highest levels of AI right down to the currents and voltages on the motors. And that is actually really important when you're solving this problem. It's a little bit unlike any other technology problem I've come across, because often technology problems are they're modularizable, if that's a word. You can separate them, you can create clean APIs between different parts of the technology stack. So that's great, because now you can get all your technologies from different places. It's not clear you can do that with AGI. It's not clear that you don't need that to solve the full problem end to end, right?
Yeah,
No one
exactly.
knows. So it's best to have the option of controlling the entire stack at that point.
Right.
Now, can I circle back? I think this is a good time. I said every time I have someone coming from the bot manufacturers, there's 2 questions I'm going to ask. I already asked them to you. Now you've had like another weekend to think about it.
Oh, here we
it
go.
comes down to the joints, which joints would you add? Which ones would you take away? And now I think it's maybe an appropriate question, because we just talked about the 5 degree of freedom neck. You decided to take a couple of degrees of freedom away. So you think it's important or not important? And
That's right.
And we also talked about the shoulder. You can talk about that again, the reason why I'd be there. So what do you think would be important for that kind of embodiment? We're no longer caring about cost or maybe, oh yeah, well, can get into a car or not get into a car or something like that. But what you think would be fundamental?
I mean, the hand still isn't there with all the degrees of freedom that we need to do all the dexterous manipulations. So one of the big ones that's missing from the hand is this kind of like palm degree of freedom.
Exactly.
For the audio listeners, I'm sort of squishing my palm together. And this is actually kind of necessary, but it's very hard to make a robot hand that does that and has all the other stuff still in the fingers and things like that. So that's kind of an open challenge. And I actually think where these hands are going to go eventually is they're going to go to a more like a more soft bodied approach, where the hand has a bunch of these like muscle wires in it and things like that. And it's much more of a tendon driven, kind of almost like a cyborg style, more soft material system. Because having a rigid palm is kind of difficult in this situation. So I think that would be an interesting degree of freedom I'd like to add to the hand. Yeah.
And then you had like on the shoulder, you talked about the scapula. as being like basically adding an 8th degree of freedom to your arms.
Yeah. Also, some degrees of freedom I wouldn't necessarily add, but I would like to improve the range on them. So, for example, the wrist is really, really important. As soon as you start trying to do teleoperation in humanoid robots, you realize how important the wrist is. Like how you, if you want to, operate a computer mouse or something like that, you're using your wrist an awful lot. And yeah, so having more range on those wrist degrees of freedom would be very helpful.
Yeah. So the
Gotcha.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to the wrist, I mean, I've kind of looked at it a lot. Is that we have a certain amount of range here, so I'm assuming you have about the right amount of range for this roll, and then the pitch. It's not even 180 degrees. I mean, sometimes we model it that way, but the reality is you try to. Oh, sorry, not 100. Barely plus or minus 90, and then the yaw this way. I don't know. What do you give? Plus or minus 30?
Yeah, that's usually the one that suffers.
Yeah, I call that the metacarpal. I mean,
I'd have to get the exact specs from the engineering team, but I know it's certainly not. It certainly doesn't go all the way that the human.
Okay, because it's still not that much for humans. So I was actually surprised for you to say that you don't have enough range of motion. But I agree that if the teleoperator has more range than your bot, that would be problematic. Yes. Maybe it's not a problem if the bot has more range than that. So basically, you want to hire old guys like me where our range of motion is maybe not so good right now.
There we go. So Suzanne, you mentioned something earlier that I want to circle back to again, which is that you just sort of by the way mentioned that in order to get to AGI, you were going to have embodied AGI or embodied AI. And I personally am a huge believer in that myself. But make an argument for that case, because the counter argument is ChatGPT or some sort of generative, pre-trained transformer that just lives in a box and answers your questions is going to be able to get to artificial general intelligence. Why do you need a body to make that happen, or at least to make it happen faster?
Well, I guess I should be less sloppy with my terminology here, because sometimes I use the word AGI when what I really mean is human-like intelligence. So
that's a good point. I want to get back to that.
There's not really a good definition for artificial general intelligence, which is one of the reasons we decided to kind of go after HLI or human-like intelligence as our mission statement, because if you can't define the thing that you're building, you're sort of like not starting off on the right foot. So I think everyone kind of has an idea. I think when people think of AGI, they actually think of human-like intelligence anyway. So I think the two things are somewhat interchangeable. But yeah, I just believe that if you want to have something that is has a mind like a person, and that mind is not connected to a body, you're just missing out on 90% of what we do in the world. Like, okay, I know it's like a sad fact that a lot of people these days just do sit behind their cell phone or computer typing with text, but the majority of our brain evolved to move our body around in the world and do exciting things and do work and interact with other people and discover things and climb trees and So I think a lot of our brain is evolved to interact with the physical environment using a body like ours. And so I just don't see how a system like a ChatGPT system can ever be truly human. I mean, maybe it's just a definitional thing, but it's literally spitting out text. Like,
can I add a term that is something that I don't know if I coined it or not. I think I did. Maybe I recoined it, but artificially intelligent agent, as opposed to AGI, I feel like is essentially a really, really smart hammer. Like, it's just a tool. It has no will of its own. It doesn't do anything. And that's very different than what you're saying, HLI, human-like intelligence. Yeah. But what I'm saying is the whole point of it, and the reason why we have bodies, well, not the reason we have, but the reason that we are the way we are is because we have needs and desires, and that gives us agency. So it's like, I'm hungry, or I want love, or, I want to go skiing, or whatever that thing is, you have desires. And so you actually motivate yourself. Whereas ChatGPT, I can open the window up and I could leave it there for a week and it's never going to do anything until I type something in and say, hey,
Are you sure, John? Like,
I don't know. Maybe it's in the background doing something. I don't know.
Is it like Toy Story when you're not looking at the monitor? You never know. And you come back and it clears the screen.
So maybe I can make kind of an interesting argument here about agency and try and tie it back in with online learning a little bit. So this might be interesting territory to go into. But one of the things about I guess the modern AI techniques, like the most cutting edge transformer models and things, they're being applied to still very specific problems. So it's like someone wants a legal document writing, right? It's like
Right.
a very specific problem. You've got a data set, you can train on it, and then it can solve that problem. What I'm interested in is systems that can actually discover new things about the world on their own, right? So you can think of this as an online learning exercise where new data is constantly coming into the system, and now it has to decide how to act on the world in order to discover or explore or utilize creativity to make new discoveries about the world. So maybe it's because I come from a scientific background, but I've always loved the idea of creating artificial scientists that can go out there and explore and do experiments and learn new things. Now, if you have an embodied system, it can take action. It has its own agency. It can now decide to go out there into the world and explore and do new things and discover things and learn from them on its own. Now, systems like the kind of text-based prediction systems can't do that.
Right.
Because the data set that they're trained on is like their entire universe. It's not like they're going out there and I mean, they're getting new data coming from people. Yeah,
there's a level of abstraction when you get to language because humans have already abstracted reality into language. So we've codified reality into this. So you've already, before the LLM even starts, it's got an advantage because it's like, oh, we've already like abstracted reality into small packets, which is helpful for it to do what it's doing now, which is really cool and useful. But I agree with you. I think that if you're going to actually interact with the world, you have to interact with the world haptically, visually, audio, all of that kind of stuff. Do you have audio inputs on Phoenix?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. All right.
But I think this point is like it's really interesting and a little subtle because so imagine you try to give agency to an LLM. What would that look like?
Right.
Well, it could look like the LLM could decide what to ask the people it was interacting with. So instead of the people always being the ones asking the question to the LLM, what if the LLM asked instead? Then it could start to explore. But the problem with that is anything a person says is already likely to have been in the training set because people have been saying things and putting them on the internet for like decades now. So it can't really explore outside of that.
But you can even think about that one step further. It's like if ChatGPT is here, you have to give it some form of embodiment to even know that I'm in the room. At least you have to access the camera. It would have to do something where it would be able to see me, see the fact that I'm crying, whatever. And then, so you're already embodying it to some extent in order for it to interact. So,
I mean, it's already embodied if you think about it, because there's some like device interface that it has to use to interact with us. So it is, it's still embodied.
Right.
And it also doesn't, it maybe has definitions of things. We touched on this, I think, a little bit in Herbert's chat. And that the possibility of emergent behaviors when you take an LLM that understands the color green, understands what a squishy box is, it can describe it, but it's never seen those things or felt those things. And now suddenly it can know all these terms, and now it can understand the terms because they're no longer abstract. You can pick them up, you can move them, it can interact with them. You can describe grass all you want, even if it understands what green is, it doesn't really go out and touch grass and look at it and everything. It really won't understand what it is and why Shakespeare and others will be writing all sorts of poems and sonnets about what the grass is and these meadows and all that does, the emotions it kind of brings. So I kind of agree that's there. And that's what's going to be interesting when you start to merge those two. And I think I learned a great word from you the other day. It was sensorium. It's a wonderful, the human sensorium. When you start to merge those other data streams in with like the language model, the expectation that you're probably going to get some emergent behavior.
And it's not that it doesn't really understand what green is. Like it has some kind of representation of the concept of green or a squishy block, but it's a very alien, like not the way we think about it in our brain. So one of the things I've always said is if you want to build AI that's friendly and safe to people, it's actually better if the representations that the model is building are as similar as possible to ours. Because then it's going to understand the world in the same way we do. And it's going to be able to think more about the consequences of its actions in the same way we do and using the same representation language. So we want to try and ground that network, that neural net as much as possible in the same way we experience the world. It'll have the same representations and it'll understand the consequences of things on people.
This is what I want is we learn language later. We understand the color green. We just don't associate a word
Yeah.
with it. Later on, the word gets associated. If you
That's
have the
right.
language model, it goes the other way. I mean, basically, which is the best direction to do it, or does it matter? Learn language and then learn your world, or learn your world and then learn language? Or is it something that would happen at the same time, that it starts to basically self-label everything, and it comes up with its own internal term for this color I seem to be seeing an awful lot everywhere?
I think you can do, you can and should do both from both directions. And the reason is we already have human language developed. So you kind of don't want this, the robot system to be developing its own. So you can train foundational models from the sensorium, like vision models, audio models, motor, large behavior models, etc. And then you could, if you wanted to, have it start to create its own labels for those representations, and those would be words, and then eventually it would develop its own language.
Here we go. Language as an emergent property.
Yeah, language could totally emerge from these lower level models.
Yes, don't give it language. Let it emerge. Let it somehow have the same sensorium. Let it emerge, and then it will create this alien language, right? And then we see if the grammar of this alien language maps to human language, and now you can come up with a universal translator. So when we do meet ET, we'll be ready.
Right. Well, that's super interesting, because in a way, when we're pre-verbal, we are learning a different language. We're learning the language of our sensorium representations. But then what we do is we link those representations to the words that we're being taught by other people, specifically our parents and our teachers in the early years. And so I think we should do both of those things. We already have large language models that can now hook into these large behavior models. So we need to make those two layers kind of talk to each other.
Can you, to get a little bit like backwards, because this is really cool, but you kind of bring up this stuff. We have haptics, audio, visual, IMU that's inside there that's telling it what its acceleration, jerk, all that stuff is. Do you all find that you have sensor fusion issues, or because it's a multimodal input stream that's coming in? And text, of course, too, because someone's speaking to you or typing it in. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sensor fusion problem is both a super difficult open research challenge, and it's one of the most promising things in the whole field, because with sensor fusion, it allows for very robust error correction. So you can have sensor, coming from a haptic sensor, a vestibular sensor, a force. We have force sensors on the joints as well, proprioception, encoder sensors. So all these signals like vision, everything is giving you extra information about the same thing with different modalities. And I think, Scott, you talked about this a little bit last time with the FSD stuff about different sensors not agreeing or agreeing with each other. But the more of these kind of cross-reference data streams you have coming from different parts of the body, the more of a holistic model of what's going on you can build, the richer your experience in your representation will be. So whilst no one really knows how to do this yet, there's some promising things going on with starting by building foundation models for each sense on its own, and then training kind of end-to-end networks that utilize those foundation models as ways of compressing into an input representation. So it's kind of like they are a way of creating a lower dimensional representation to then train a larger kind of meta model on top of that. And I actually think that's kind of the way to go, because that's kind of how our brain works as well. It's maybe not quite that simple, but we do have these specialized areas that deal with vision and like face detection and language understanding and things like this. So we do kind of have these like little modular foundational models that all evolved, and then the brain also evolved a sort of a more abstract umbrella structure on top of that to sensor fuse them all.
But those sensors tend to be more orthogonal to each other, so the data tends to be more of a complementary data set than a conflicting data set. Whereas when you go to the example of radar and vision, they're not really orthogonal. They're kind of giving what could potentially be
true.
So I don't know. Does that sound ever conflict with vision?
They're still very correlated. Like even if you imagine just turning your head changes like your spatial audio awareness and things like that. It changes your vestibular detection at the same time. And everything's kind of like tied together.
I guess, so there's probably some tuning, but there may be some sensors that complement more and others that will tend to get in conflict more often, unless you can figure out what is the reason that you're putting it in conflict. So that's why I almost look at It's a bad idea
Awesome,
to have multiple sensors that are basically doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but I would throw in also that FSD, the autonomous driving, sorry, at a more general level is a very, very special case because you're going at extremely high speed and safety is utterly critical. You don't have 2 seconds to stay still and figure out what's really going on, which we humans do. I mean, we're evolved to go at, a couple of meters per second or something. That's basically what we can run or walk at. And so we can take a moment and we can go like, whoa, we're getting different, sensor stuff. Let's figure it out. And a humanoid bot, I think, can do that. So it makes a lot more sense to have a humanoid bot have multiple input streams, whereas a car, it's just like it does one task and it needs to do it really, really well and never make a mistake. So, and you do throw out some stuff, obviously. You can't drive in a heavy snowstorm or pitch black dark without some sort of radar system or something. And, so you're losing some capabilities in the car, but the advantages under that very specific use case is that you're actually getting what you need, which is high degrees of safety under normal circumstances, right? It doesn't have to work 100% of the time, just like 95% of the time. So,
this comparison of like full self-driving to autonomous humanoid robots is interesting because it's not clear that it's helpful at all to try and transfer any of those models, because first of all, the humanoid robot has way many more degrees of freedom than a car. Car basically has kind of like 2 or 3 degrees of freedom, depending on how you count. And the other interesting thing is, so the really, really hard problem about training autonomous models to control robots is that you think about a car, its job is to not collide with anything.
Right.
Whereas the job of the humanoid robot is to collide its hands and fingers with everything. So this
John, sound familiar?
Differentiation is kind of it's the biggest problem. It's why we don't have fully autonomous dexterous robots yet. Is no one's really solved this problem of how do you predict and then use contact physics and controlled collision. That's like a phrase I like.
I'll give you my quote on that. FSD job is not to interact with the world, whereas the human bot is supposed to interact with the world. So you're right. They're polar opposites when it comes to what it is they're supposed to do. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. I want to be respectful of your time, and we've been going for almost an hour here. But I want to talk because you're also an artist. I know it goes fast. It goes way too fast. But you're also an artist. I see that you do painting and some music and things like that. And I want to talk about robots in arts, but then also something that really causes a lot of people a lot of fear is, are they going to just take our jobs? And what the hell do we do after they take our jobs? I think those are sort of related, but I don't know. You can break them apart or answer them both at once or however you want to deal with that.
Okay, I have to exercise my creativity now and find a very creative answer to this question that encompasses AI art and jobs. Okay, so here goes. So one of the places that I think there's a really interesting intersection between the art and the kind of, I guess, robotic engineering side of things is in scientific discovery. So one of the things I've always wanted to do, since I got into this field is try and create this idea of an artificial scientist. And so the idea would be that you have a robot system that can make scientific discoveries about the world. And if it was in a humanoid form factor, it could now actually go into a lab or like go to CERN or something and actually do the experiments physically. Actually changing the dials and knobs on scientific instruments, right? So the cool thing about this is that it's a very creative pursuit, because trying to come up with a new experimental design for a science is something that's requires actually a lot of creativity. And it also would require this embodied AI to then actually do the scientific experiments themselves. And the third reason I like this is because it's not taking away any jobs. I truly believe that we need to keep advancing our knowledge about the world, keep advancing science, but we don't really have a good way to train up lots of scientists to postgrad, postdoctoral, professor level, right?
You can make an argument that that's 30 years, basically.
Yeah,
from birth
30 years to
PhD,
train a scientist. And even then you're assuming they don't go and do something else or like this. So if we had a way of just creating an AI model that could be downloaded into a robot and make them an instant super scientist. And then that AI model could also be reading every single publication that came out every day, which a human scientist can't. Now that thing can go forward and make amazing scientific advances for our civilization in a way we can't. So I'm always trying to look for ways to make these new AI technologies, these new robot systems go beyond us, do things that we just can't do as people, but we want. And there's a little bit of like being humble and like removing hubris needed here. So we have to admit, first and foremost, we are not that great at science. Yeah, I realized when I was doing physics, I'm actually not that great at physics. I kind of had that realization at some point. And at that point, I started thinking, could we design robots and AIs to do science for us? But I think if we can say, like, at some point, we're just going to max out. I don't know if it's now or in 20 years' time, our little human brains are not going to be able to comprehend all this science anymore. I argue we can't already. So can we bring this technology to bear on problems that would really help us as a society without all this like taking jobs away? Can we find work for them to do that is new, that opens up the economy more, that would not otherwise be done?
This is an interesting twist, because everyone's been saying it the other way around, that the robots are going to do the mundane things. And now we will be able to do new things that we couldn't before. And now you flip this.
I think they still will. So I'm not saying like, I think robots still will do the dull, dirty, dangerous jobs, but I want them to do those in the unfilled job positions. And then, but once you've got that, you've now started to get systems that now understand the world. They're learning on the job. The large language models are getting better all the time. Why don't we just jump? Why don't we take the leap from those dull, dirty, dangerous, unfilled positions right out to something that, you know, would not otherwise be being done? Why do we have to go through this middle phase of taking everyone's jobs? We don't, right? We can go straight from unfilled labor jobs right to super scientists.
There's two jobs you want them to do: the unfilled and the unfulfilling.
Yeah.
That's it.
Nice. Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's actually you get a dad in the room here. It's like the puns just keep coming.
No, but I love that. It's a very kind of optimistic way of looking at things, because, you know, you look at the labor statistics and you see huge gaps in filling jobs. Many of them are dull, dirty, or dangerous, right? You know, those kinds of jobs particularly. And so it makes really good sense. And that's a really good way to upscale things so that they become less expensive and more commoditized to some extent, like the hardware becomes more commoditized. So you don't have to vertically integrate. Every single company doesn't have to reinvent the actuator. And so that gives you that leg up. But then once you do that, you've also got the brain at the same time that's being constructed. That's amazing. And you put those two things together.
This is something that's not appreciated, is how fast these things are going to go from, moving, sorting automotive car parts into boxes to being able to solve problems in biomedical research, right? It's not clear that that's not going to be a pretty big leap. So, I like this idea of, and again, this is where I think governments have to come in, because companies and corporations and the way the economy is set up and the way capitalism works is, if we don't step in and do something, it's absolutely going to go through this phase where we start with unfulfilled jobs, and then companies want to grow, they want to expand, so they'll start to eat away at regular jobs. But we don't have to do that. If there are incentives and structures in place, we can jump straight to jobs that people don't do today, like these this idea of artificial scientists and things like that. So there needs to be incentives and structures put in place, and a lot of thought going into this, and a lot of like think tanks and kind of governments getting involved and understanding this technology. But I think there's a way to thread the needle here.
Cool. All right, that's very exciting. I think I really wanted to talk about consciousness, quantum computing, and all that stuff, but we'll save that for another conversation. So we'll wrap it up there, because I think that's a really optimistic way to look, and actually a call to the government, I think, is a reasonable idea. Not the stick, but more the carrot. It's like, how do you guide people to want to incentivize companies to, instead of just looking after the bottom line and saying, oh, we could replace this worker and save $10,000 a year, so haha, you're gone, to like, let's expand the labor pool, the definition of what labor is. That's great.
Yeah, let's take our civilization to the next level with super scientist AIs that can solve, outstanding problems for us.
Yeah. And work 24/7, just like in there all the time. So yeah.
A lot of hobbies look like work to me. people like them
Yeah.
because they're fulfilling. So you will always have a choice.
Exactly. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. This was just amazing. Everybody be sure to follow her on LinkedIn, on X. I don't know why I said LinkedIn.
I'm on LinkedIn
I was working
too,
on
if you want.
yeah, you're on LinkedIn too. I was working on a job posting today, so I guess it's stuck in my brain. But also follow sanctuary.ai and check out what they're doing. And there's new announcements coming soon, I gather. So, you know, pay attention and see what's going on in the world. Thank you again so much. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.